There's been a lot
and I don't get bits until I get paid from Twitch.
of talk recently
Yay, e-begging. Sorry.
about this idea of systemic racism, sometimes called institutional racism, and basically the idea is that the systems and institutions in this country are inherently racist, and it is for that reason that we see differences between white people and black people in things like incarceration rates, wealth, loan approval rates, etc. But what you'll find is that the levels to which these activists are willing to go in speculating and extrapolating to preserve this narrative approach the levels of like flat eartherism. For example, you've got people like Tariq Nasheed who claim that the reason that Asian people are on average more...
Oh, the Streamlabs link? It's below my chat. It's like, hold on. I'll put it in the chat. It's like, oh god, there's me talking about me talking. It's the tip button here on Streamlabs.
There's nothing funny about the
It's
tools
like,
of
oh god,
capitalism
there's
or
me
for
talking about me talking. It's the tip button here on Streamlabs.
There's nothing funny about the
It's
tools
like,
of
oh god,
capitalism
there's
or
me
for
talking about me talking. That's a lot of me talking about me talking about me talking. Ask Compu. It's alright. I don't expect anyone to do anything. I just was putting it out there.
More successful than white people in this country is because white people use their system of white supremacy to artificially elevate Asian people so as not to reveal themselves as the ones really in control of things. And I don't know about you guys, but I'm not in that group chat. But anyways, these ideas have been pretty well debunked by people on the right, but I've got some things that I think are important to add. And so we'll go through some of the logical inconsistencies within the idea and the surrounding movement, and we'll also disprove the specific examples of systemic racism in employment, our justice system, wealth, all sorts of stuff. It's going to be another long one, another big fella. Definitely going to want to watch all the way through. Watch it in parts if you have to. Should be very epic, so do stay tuned.
I hate his intro so much.
Welcome to Heck
Off, Commie.
Your second reminder that the long-awaited, much-requested Heck Off Commie Discord server is up and running. If you want access, you have to get a membership over at heckoffcommie.com for $4. It's been a blast so far, so the people complaining about having to pay $4 for a Discord, it's just not fair. The reason we do it isn't even for money. It's to maintain a high average IQ in the server.
Oh shit, Excessive Observer with a $20 donation. Thank you. I really, really appreciate that. You have no idea. Those late fees would have really sucked. I get, every time my account's in the negative for 24 hours, I get a $30 fee. So thank you. I really appreciate that.
We know that IQ is one of the strongest predictors of income, so if you're complaining about $4 to support the channel, probably means that you didn't belong in the server in the first place, quite frankly. But anyways, speaking very broadly, systemic racism is a pretty new vocab word for us. It's not something that's been in the mainstream for a while, and that's because the 2010s were the decade in which everything became woke. We're probably going to have to spend the rest of our lives trying to undo the damage that occurred in that decade, and of course...
Oh no! The damage of LGBTQ people having rights and black people not being, well, not even not being, talking about being shot by the police. What damage, John? What the fuck are you talking about?
Of course, in the previous decades, but a great way that we know this is by running searches in LexisNexis, which is a huge, huge research database, and we can find graphs of the prevalence of certain terms in the New York Times, which we'll use as sort of this focal point of American journalism and news. And what we see is the prevalence of things like whiteness, critical race theory, which I like to pretend is the theory that white people are the only race that you can be critical of, but I think it actually means basically like viewing all issues through a racially based lens. Also, unconscious bias, white privilege, systemic racism, discrimination, social justice, racism, white supremacy, etc. The prevalence of all these in mainstream news and journalism has skyrocketed, and so we have to ask ourselves why that is, because looking at our country objectively, it's inarguably become less racist than
objectively
since like the 1960s culturally.
Sure, I would agree that we're less racist as a society than we were in the 60s. But we were really, 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 really racist in the 60s. So even coming to today, when we've mitigated many of the problems that we had in the 60s in regard to race, it doesn't mean we don't have a different set of problems. We still have these systematic issues where, for instance, black communities are treated worse than white communities in terms of policing, in terms of schooling, in terms of overall funds. You know, like, these are issues that we still need to face, and they're still a result of things that we're like, oh wow, Tanthier, thanks for the $20 you provided me with years of content, you deserve this, and Big Booty Goth Queer for $15 hugs. I appreciate that, guys, really. Thank you so much.
100% legally, there are no laws that are written to discriminate against minorities. In fact, we now have laws that grant minorities legal privileges, which technically means they discriminate against white people, but...
No. Stuff like, Programs that help people of color get employed are there in order to mitigate the result of them having a systematic disadvantage in the first place. It's not an advantage, it's trying to level the field because they're already lower in terms of social disadvantage.
Anyways, despite all of this, there are still disparities between races of people in America. And so the idea is that this is because of racism. Now,
it's due to many factors. Racism is a factor, but it's also due to the fact that we still are dealing with the results of racist policies of the past. For instance, if you're white, chances are your family has had more generations in order to develop generational wealth, in order to raise money so that they can send the next generation off to college and do better for themselves, and then hopefully send their kids to college or whatever, or invest in businesses or property, or have what's the word I'm thinking of? Have equity in property like your house. Whereas in the black community, renting is really, really high, so they're not building equity generationally. So these are all issues that we face today that aren't new issues, but they're issues that are a result of issues that we faced in the past that we never really solved.
as far as how to actually go about fighting this systemic racism, it's pretty hard to find a clear guide. Even if you read articles about all the different ways that you can fight systemic racism, you'll basically find that they boil down to contact a politician. They don't really tell you what to say other than, we want justice and stop racism. By the way, if you actually want to stop racism, I'll show you how I did it.
Ask Compy with a bit says, man starts race war against Olympic athletes dehydrated. What? We can't give them water. That wouldn't be fair to the hydrated Olympic athletes. Yeah. Good analogy.
At the end of the video, but they'll also tell you to give money to groups of people who are supposedly working towards these goals, or they'll tell you to prioritize giving money to businesses operated by black people, or sign petitions calling for justice, and just more vague pontification. So what it really boils down to, once you figure out what they actually want, once you get past the yard signs and the chanting, when you get to like what they're actually calling for, what they're saying is that the only way to combat systemic racism is to write into the system advantages for people of color. But
in order to mitigate those disadvantages until such a time that those disadvantages no longer present themselves within society. Again, for instance, if generational wealth became more or less on par between white communities and black communities in the future, then you would no longer have the need to make policy in order to help people who are already disadvantaged become up to par with the general people within society, right? That's the entire point. These problems already haven't been solved. You can talk to me all day once the problems get solved, but they're not. So what are you talking about? Thank you to Bishop Paul IV with, $10. Thank you. So I don't really know much about the topic of trans people. I don't know anyone who is in this group and haven't spoken to anyone in this group. However, it's important to keep an open mind and be respectful. I hope you don't mind me dropping in. Hey, whatever. That's cool. Thanks. I appreciate the $10 anyway. People with less experience are always welcome here,
specifically black people, which would imply that what is keeping black people down isn't the system, but the choices that they make.
No. Many people's decisions are the result of the society in which they grow up. For instance, if you are born into a poor community, as many black communities in the U.S. are, again, due to these systematic issues that stem back to both Jim Crow and slavery, and we're still dealing with the outcome of today, you are in a more desperate position. You are going to be more likely to make certain decisions, like committing crimes, joining gangs, any of these things. And this is a result of the world in which they grow up. It's not something that is race-specific, but rather it has to do with a series of outcomes that are more likely to happen to be because of people in poverty, right? If you put, like, a white kid in the same situation, more or less they have the same rates of, like, crime or joining gangs or whatever, So.
And the reason for that is when you have
at least in urban areas. Poor white people in rural areas don't have many gang issues because gangs tend to be an issue in higher density population areas, not when you live like a mile away from your neighbors or whatever.
Systems like we do in America that not only don't discriminate, but even go as far as to actively protect against discrimination. If you're going to get different results in that system, which treats everyone equally on paper, then it must...
Oh, Squid, thank you for the $20. Wow, you guys have been so nice. I really, really appreciate all of that. Thank you so much.
Must be the fault of the individuals and not the system. And to this they'll say, well, but it doesn't treat people the same. That's the problem. And they'll show you figures that show different...
Thank you to Bishop Paul IV. Thank you for following. Welcome.
Differences between groups of people and claim that that's because of racism. What that fails to take into account is Like we said, the system is applied equally to everyone. So if you're seeing things like higher rates of incarceration between groups, for example, that would be exactly what we would expect if we had an objective legal system and we had differences in crime rates between groups of people, which is
right. We have differences in crime rates, again, because of the systematic injustices that have been perpetrated upon the black community, and which has basically pushed them into poverty, into the margins of society. So if you have a community of people in high-density areas with little money, they're going to be more likely to commit certain crimes. And this is on top of course, the fact that there is more policing in those areas, let's say.
Exactly the case if you look at the data. And so the point is that by these advocacy groups saying that the only way to fix the system is by writing into it advantages for minority groups, they're implicitly acknowledging that the system isn't the reason for the differences in outcome, but rather...
No, it's not. It's admitting that the system is already stacked in favor of certain people and trying to level the playing field for those who are at a disadvantage.
It's the result of choices being made by the individuals, which we'll get into in more detail as we continue. But that's why it's difficult to establish a clear definition or example of racism and discrimination in America, because racism doesn't actually exist anymore in the way that they...
Fucking what? 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 That's a real claim from ex-Subway employee, or maybe current Subway employee, I'm not sure, John Doyle. Racism doesn't exist anymore. We did it, folks. Let's pack it up. We fucking nailed it.
Claim that it does. It's not a real thing. And that's the strategy behind it. It is vaguely defined and it is applied selectively and ambiguously so as to keep those in power in control of you and the narrative. That's why we scratch our heads when they're openly racist against white people or they're in support of things like Planned Parenthood, which has been responsible for the murder of millions of black children.
There's nothing funny about the tools of capitalism.
Thank you to Cotton Candy 903 with 10 bits. Oh my god, shoot me. In Minecraft. John, just because people don't consider abortion murdering children like you do doesn't mean that they don't care about black people. Okay? Because I guarantee, out of the number of people who get abortions at Planned Parenthood, most of them are white. So...
And we're scratching our heads because we make the mistake of believing that they actually care about racism, but they don't. They never did.
Incorrect.
What they care about is power. That's why fighting racism is literally a billion-dollar industry now, why a movement which supposed...
John Doyle, racism doesn't exist anymore, except against white people. Yep, he's an idiot.
...supposedly seeks to spread the idea that Black Lives Matter is actually a spearhead for a radically left agenda, the likes of which we've never seen before as far as their power and influence go. And that's why...
A radically left agenda, like not killing people of color when they're being held by the police... My goodness, yes, I'm sure Stalin himself would weep at how left that agenda is.
The entire media and establishment of mega corporations, and of course all of the left, but even a bunch of supposedly Republican politicians, they're all right there behind them because they want power. And the beauty of it is that they maintain this narrative of revolution and being the counterculture, despite the fact that they're literally in control of everything just mentioned, all because they're stupid. They think that their grandma making a negative comment about their nose piercing is evidence that they're the dissenting voice in society, but they're not. The system and the society that they're supposedly fighting against is literally just me, you, Donald Trump, and the MyPillow guy. Like that.
Wait a minute. Did you just say just Donald Trump? You mean the president of the United States? The individual with the most power in the country? The like most influential country in the world? There's no systematic racism. The only racists are me, the MyPillow guy, and the leader of the free world. One of these things is not like the other. One of these things just doesn't belong.
That's our A team. You know, of course there are other people, but you get the point. We're not exactly in the best position.
B4000,
right now,
thanks for following.
those are the questions that they have no answers for. And we'll get into those in greater detail. But questions like, since America has undeniably become less racist in the last 60 years, why have things largely not changed as far as disparities between black people and white people go?
Because while we dealt with the racism of individuals and specifically like literally not letting people not hire people because of the color of their skin by letter of the law, though I'm sure that still happens, they just don't say that that's the reason for doing so, we haven't tackled the underlying issues that still plague the black community in the United States because of the history of both bondage and racism that carried through to Jim Crow up until 1969 when the Civil Rights Act was passed, right? So, for instance, John, your parents, their parents, their parents, their parents, their parents didn't have to deal with systematic racism, and their grandparents weren't slaves, most likely, right? So, you've had generations and generations and generations to build equity and wealth, or at the very least, not be disadvantaged, not be discriminated against for housing, not be discriminated against for jobs, and that benefits you. The black community does not have the same benefit, right? We're only talking about 1969 when the Civil Rights Act was passed. My parents are older than the Civil Rights Act by 2 years. Like, why do you talk about this stuff like it's ancient history when it is not? These are things that affected people who are alive today and continue to affect their children and grandchildren.
Why have they gotten worse in many cases, such as wealth gaps between black people and white people, differences in the rates of single motherhood, income gaps between black men and white men, income gaps between black women and white women, the fact that the poverty rate was declining until the 1960s, the same decade in which the majority of the civil rights movement took place, but then once the war on poverty occurred, the poverty rate started to increase dramatically. How is it that
Part of that has to do with capitalism. I know you're not going to like that because you have a whole enjoy capitalism sticker on your laptop, but that is the case. Past the 1960s into the 70s and 80s, and especially after Reagan, the Republican Party continued to do things to destroy labor in this country, to destroy the rights of labor, and thereby they helped create a system in which most of the profit goes directly to people at the top, while the people who actually do the work get shafted. Welcome to America, John. Enjoy capitalism.
that America has become less racist, but the things that our racism is supposedly causing have become much worse? And how is it that gaps between white people and Hispanics exist? When have we ever systemically oppressed Hispanic people? And if
Seriously? Do you not realize that the president right now really doesn't like Hispanic people, much less in the past? People are racist against tons of people who are all sorts of different colors outside of white. Are you fucking kidding? You idiot. Cotton Candy 903 with 10 bits. Isn't the first black girl to attend an all-white school only in like the in her 50s? Yeah, something like that. Look up America's history in Latin America. Yeah.
if you can find proof of that, can you explain why we oppress them less than blacks? Since that's what the disparities would suggest if we operate under the assumption that they're caused by racism. And also,
probably because America has a real issue with black people. There are a lot of people in the United States, due to its history, due to the fact that black people were slaves in the United States for so long, who still go out of their way to believe that black people are somehow inherently worse than white people and deserve less. That's why. People like you do this too. When you're saying that black people just commit more crimes because they're black, that's what you're doing. You're implying that because of the color of their skin, they're somehow inherently worse than you, less moral, more likely to commit crimes, without looking at any of the sociological factors that go into the committance and punishment of those crimes.
why do we love Asians more than ourselves? Why do we allow Asians to do better than us by so many significant metrics? Also interesting about this theory of systemic racism is that they admit that even if there were no racist people occupying the system, it would still be racist by virtue of its existence, and it's impossible.
Not by virtue of its existence, but the fact that the system that is currently in place was still created in such a way to benefit white people and disadvantage people who are not white. That's what we're talking about when we say systematic racism. It's not that literally everyone controlling the levers of society, whatever you want to call that, is racist. It's that the people who set this system up, not even like, I'm not talking about people sitting in a war room somewhere going, how do we screw over black people? Although I'm sure that has happened on several occasions. Reagan war on drugs. But people who put these systems into place did so in such a way that would benefit them and people like them, right? So the systems, as they work in the favor of certain groups and work at a disadvantage for others. Sorry, I've been going for almost 4 hours. I'm kind of like scatterbrained right now.
Possible to change that. Therefore, it has to be replaced with something woke and progressive as decided by everyone except white men who like to pray to God, save their country, and kiss girls, in that order.
Oh my god! Oh, that's the cringiest shit ever! White men who pray to God. Okay, there are a lot of Christian women and black people. Second, save your country? What? What the fuck are you talking about? Are you talking about, like, soldiers? Because there are people of all races that are soldiers. In fact, low-income black communities are a huge recruiting zone for the military. So, maybe don't to any of this.
And the problem is that if the system exists on paper with no reference to targeting specific groups of people, complete equality under the law, then if there are differences in outcomes between groups of people under that system, even if according to them, those in charge of maintaining and operating that system were not at all racist or subject to bias, then that...
Okay, but the system itself can be set up with from people who did have a bias, and they set up the system in such a way to ensure that that bias is carried out even when they are not in control of it anymore. Look at the drug laws in America. Right? Look at policing in America. These things systematically oppress black people. Look at the fact that you can look at the statistics of drug crimes and you can see that black people get longer, harsher sentences for the same crime as white people, right?
That must be because those groups, on average, do not exhibit exactly the same behavior. That is how a rational person would interpret what we're dealing with here. And on top of that, we know...
So again, he's literally going for some sort of biological essentialism where he's like, black people just commit crime because they're black. That's fucked up, John. And it's not evidenced by the facts.
Of a system that actively benefits non-white people with things like affirmative action, subsidized loan programs, diversity quotas, etc., etc. So now,
again, these are all programs that are in place to try and offset the systematic disadvantage already at play, and we see this because the outcomes that black people have in society here in the US are worse off than people in other racial groups. So clearly, these systems and these programs continue to need to work until such a time as we can get to some sort of parity in terms of outcomes. At least parity in the sense that, you know, roughly the same percentage of people in certain groups are going to be successful. Of course, we're always going to have people in society that are more successful or less successful, even if we make positive changes to our system to make it more socialist. Like, there's still going to be people who are the boss and people who are somewhat less paid, although not with the disparity we currently see. You know, you're always going to have some people who are a little more skilled than some people who aren't. But what we see in the disparity between different races now is not some natural thing that just occurs out of nowhere. It's the result of decades and decades of systematic racism and systems that have an advantage towards white people. What we're doing now is trying to give sort of a leg up to people who aren't white to try and fix the problems of the past until such a time as we can reach parity with each other.
Now, even when that system is actively giving different groups an advantage over other groups, those differences exist. And if that doesn't compel you to think that perhaps it isn't actually the system and it's just people being free to make choices and then choosing different things, then you should probably just stop watching now, because none of what we're about to get into is going to change your mind, because at that point, you're not concerned with truth. You're concerned with social adulation.
John, it's hilarious to me that you talk about this stuff as if you aren't the advantaged one and you haven't felt the advantage. For instance, you live with your parents. I know this. You can look up John's voter record and you can see that he lives with his parents. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? John, it's completely okay for you to be living with your parents, but the fact that you have the benefit of doing so while building your business here on YouTube is a benefit to you caused by the fact that your parents were able to build equity in a home that they have the money to afford and have the extra space for you to continue to live there despite the fact that you are an adult. And that's fine, and that's great. But you, benefiting from that system, shouldn't say to other people who don't have the same benefits, say, well, why didn't you just do what I did and start a YouTube channel? Well, John, maybe they didn't have the extra room in their parents' house because their parents don't have a house. Maybe they don't have the money to go buy a microphone and a laptop and have the time to edit videos because they live with their parents, and instead they have to actually work and go out and spend all their time working their fingers to the bone so that they can afford rent for their shitty apartment they aren't building equity in. Like, it's so hypocritical for you, John, to be like, I have never benefited from this system. Meanwhile, you're literally in your parents' house recording your YouTube series, which presumably you make a decent amount of money on, and you don't have to pay like a mortgage payment because you live with your parents. Like, what?
With virtue signaling. It is basically unlikely that you view the world as anything that deviates from all 7 billion of us being only 2 hours of diversity training away from singing Kumbaya and doing trust falls. It's just not a realistic view of the world. And if you actually want to solve the problems, you have to identify them correctly. But you don't actually want to solve the problems. You just want to use them as a Trojan horse to fundamentally decompose and irreparably alter the country, which is...
No, I'd like to solve the problems. The problems being solved probably takes fundamentally changing certain things about the country. For instance, police training, who gets approved to be a police officer, police use of force. But those things, it would be a positive change. The fact that you use the term change interchangeably with scary bad thing is ridiculous. We've made changes all throughout the history of America, and even beyond that, all throughout the history of the world. And I don't know about you, but I'd rather live in the America of today than the America 10 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, right? And that increases as we go further back in time, even though we're in a rough period right now in 2020, right? We will continue to make changes in such a way that in hopefully the year 2030, 2040, 2050, I would prefer to live there than I would here in 2020, right? That's what you do as a society. You continually improve, and if you don't, you either stagnate or you devolve, and that's not good.
Which is why you say things like, it seems like there are too many black men in prison. Hey, do you want to destroy the Western nuclear family and get people to stop thinking that being straight is normal? It's dishonest, it's destructive, but most of all, the greatest sin of them all, it's just plain annoying. It could have been so beautiful. I just wanted to grill. That's all I wanted, but now we can't. You guys ruined it. That's the difference between us and everyone who doesn't get it. We know that we can never go back to the barbecue. But we'll get into it now. We're going to go through the 6 most common examples of systemic racism or institutional racism. And a lot of times there are connections between them. And so we'll do our best to sort of explain those connections and how racism isn't the reason for these disparities on a categorical level, but also...
So that's the intro. I'm going to save the rest of this for like tomorrow or the next day. Okay? I'll bookmark this. And we will... hold on, let me save this to a... Do I have a watch later playlist? I'll save this to my watch later playlist, and we will finish this next Chud watch, okay? Or at least do the next part. I don't know if we'll finish the whole thing, but we'll come